Picture this. It is early morning somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, and the sky is quiet. Then the sirens start. Iranian drones, dozens of them, streak across the desert toward the gleaming facilities of Yanbu, Saudi Arabia's gateway to the Red Sea. This is not a drill. This is the real thing. And what happens next could determine whether the world economy survives the next 6 months intact. Because here is what almost nobody is talking about. Iran's most terrifying weapon in this war is not a missile. It is not a submarine mine. It is not even a nuclear threat. Iran's most terrifying weapon is a choke point 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. A sliver of blue water through which 20 million barrels of oil flow every single day. The Strait of Hormuz. For decades, Iran has dangled the threat of closing it like a sword over the throat of the global economy. And on the 4th of March, 2026, they finally pulled the trigger. But here is the part that will shock you. Saudi Arabia saw this coming not just days in advance, not weeks, but decades. And buried in the scorching desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula, running 1,200 kilometers from one coast to the other, is the engineering masterpiece that just saved the world from a $200 oil catastrophe. Stay with us, because this story has layers that go far beyond the headlines. And by the end of this analysis, you will understand not only who built the escape hatch the world needed, but who is quietly getting rich off the chaos while the rest of the world scrambles for answers. Let us go back to where this began. On the 28th of February, 2026, coordinated airstrikes were launched against Iran under what was designated Operation Epic Fury. The targets were military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership infrastructure. Among those killed was the supreme leader. Iran's response was immediate and furious. Missile barrages rained down on Israeli cities, on military bases across the Gulf, on infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain. And then on the 4th of March, Iran did what it had always threatened to do. It effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas, 20 million barrels of crude oil per day, passes through that narrow maritime corridor. About 84% of those shipments are headed to Asian markets. China receives roughly 1/3 of its oil through the strait. Europe gets between 12 and 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar, and that gas travels through Hormuz first. So when Iran pulled the plug, the world did not just feel it, the world choked. The effective closure stranded approximately 16 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products and 11 to 12 billion cubic feet per day of liquefied natural gas, almost 1/5 of global supplies of each commodity. Storage capacity limits across the Gulf were hit almost immediately. Production shutdowns followed. The collective oil output of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by just the 10th of March. By the 12th of March, that figure had reached at least 10 million barrels per day. The International Energy Agency described it simply as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Those are not words taken lightly. That is the IEA. And as if the oil shock was not enough, the closure triggered what analysts described as a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states. The Gulf imports the vast majority of its food, around 70% of caloric intake, through the Strait of Hormuz. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. Retailers were airlifting staples. Consumer prices in parts of the Gulf spiked between 40 and 120%. Iran had also targeted something even more existential: desalination plants in Kuwait and Qatar. Desalination provides 99% of drinking water in some of these nations. These are not just economic targets, these are survival targets. So this is the picture: the most critical energy corridor on the planet shut, global supply chains fracturing, oil prices spiking past $120 per barrel for Brent crude, markets in free fall, and the entire world holding its breath. Here is where it gets extraordinary. Because while the world was panicking, Saudi Arabia was executing a plan that had been sitting in a drawer since 1981. The East West Crude Oil Pipeline, also known as Petroline, also known as the escape hatch Saudi Arabia built 45 years ago for exactly this moment. Here is the background. In 1981, at the height of the Iran-Iraq War, oil tankers in the Persian Gulf began coming under attack. The Saudi government looked at the Strait of Hormuz and recognized a terrifying vulnerability. If that choke point ever closed, their entire oil export economy and, by extension, the global energy market would be held hostage. So they built a workaround, a massive land-based pipeline stretching 1,200 kilometers across the scorching desert of the Arabian Peninsula, running from east to west at a cost of $2.5 billion at the time, equivalent to roughly $8.5 billion today. It connected the massive Abqaiq oil processing facility on the coast of the Persian Gulf in eastern Saudi Arabia to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. Once oil enters the pipeline, it takes approximately 72 hours to traverse the full length of the country. Within hours of the first strikes on Iran, Saudi Arabia rolled out this contingency plan, one that had waited 45 years to come to fruition. According to Saudi Aramco's chief executive, the company immediately began ramping up crude flows through the East-West Pipeline toward its full capacity of 7 million barrels per day. To understand the scale of what happened next, consider this. In January and February of 2026, before the crisis, an average of just 770,000 barrels per day flowed through that pipeline. According to trade intelligence data, by early March, that figure had jumped to 2.9 million barrels per day and was climbing fast toward the 7 million barrel ceiling. Exports from Yanbu surged by over 330%. 25 supertankers began loading cargo at Red Sea ports within a single week. The queues of massive vessels stretched across the water. And here is what this achievement actually means. Iran's entire strategy was built on a single premise: close Hormuz and the world begs. But Saudi Arabia had quietly built itself a way out. The combination of Petroline and the port of Yanbu effectively allowed the kingdom to maintain the lion's share of its export capacity, an estimated 6 million barrels per day through Yanbu, bypassing the choke point entirely. Now, Saudi Arabia is not the only country with a trick up its sleeve. The United Arab Emirates had its own strategic weapon, and it is just as impressive. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, also known as ADCOP, stretches 360 to 400 kilometers, 48 inches in diameter, from the Habshan oil fields deep in the interior of Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the coast of the Gulf of Oman. The key word in that sentence is Gulf of Oman, not Persian Gulf. Fujairah sits entirely outside the Strait of Hormuz. Completed in 2012 at a cost of $3.3 billion and managed by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, this pipeline delivers the UAE's prized Murban crude oil directly to a port that Iranian missiles and mines cannot easily reach. Before the crisis, ADCOP typically ran at a comfortable 1 to 1.1 million barrels per day. When the Hormuz crisis erupted, the UAE activated the pipeline's full operational potential. According to energy analysts, ADCOP was rapidly pushed toward and past its nominal ceiling of 1.5 million barrels per day, approaching an operational maximum of 1.8 million barrels. Fujairah, with storage capacity of approximately 18 million cubic meters, is one of the world's largest fuel supply hubs. Murban crude flowed uninterrupted to Asian markets, to China, to India, without a single tanker needing to enter the dangerous Persian Gulf waters. Iran saw what was happening, and they did not simply accept it. In mid-March, Iranian drones struck directly at the port of Fujairah. Operations were temporarily suspended between the 14th and 16th of March due to fires that broke out at the facility. The National Oil Company moved quickly, containing the damage and restoring operations within hours. A second major attack struck the Ruwais refinery, one of the world's largest, forcing a temporary shutdown. But the core export infrastructure held, and the oil kept flowing. Now, let us put these numbers into the broader picture, because this is where things get mathematically sobering. Saudi Arabia's Petroline pipeline at full capacity, 7 million barrels per day. The UAE's ADCOP at full stretch approaching 1.8 million barrels per day. Combined, roughly 8.8 million barrels per day of bypass capacity. Compare that to the 20 million barrels that normally transit Hormuz daily. According to technical analyses, these alternative routes can replace approximately 20 to 35% of normal Hormuz traffic. That leaves a gap, a big one. But the issue is not about replacing every single barrel. It is about managing market psychology. It is about preventing the complete collapse of confidence, the kind of doomsday scenario that tips oil prices to $200 and sends the global economy into a spiral that takes a decade to unwind. On that specific front, Saudi Arabia and the UAE succeeded. Oil prices climbed steeply past $120 per barrel, but they did not reach the apocalyptic levels Iran had gambled on. The pipelines worked as a pressure valve. Enough supply stayed flowing to keep markets from completely losing their minds. But here is where we need to stop and be honest. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have largely rescued themselves. The rest of the Gulf has not been so fortunate. The ports of Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar remain effectively paralyzed. As of the latest reports, approximately 400 massive commercial ships are stranded in Gulf waters, unable to move. Iraq's Rumaila oil field began shutting down operations in early March due to a complete lack of storage space. Tankers simply could not leave the strait. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports, the first time in the company's history, following the closure of Hormuz on the 4th of March. Europe, which had come to rely on Gulf refineries for roughly 30% of its diesel imports and half of its jet fuel, is now staring down a supply crunch with no easy fix. And the global ripple effects are already brutal. Pakistan was forced to close schools due to the energy cost surge. In India, restaurants shut down under government-mandated energy restrictions. Thailand officially banned elevator use in public buildings to conserve electricity. The International Energy Agency executed the largest emergency strategic reserve release in its history, releasing a full 400 million barrels of oil onto the market in a desperate attempt to suppress prices. A research note modeled the economic impact and estimated that a Hormuz closure, removing close to 20% of global oil supplies in the second quarter of 2026, is expected to raise the average oil price to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in that quarter alone. That is not a recession. That is a jolt, and it compounds every quarter the strait stays closed. Now let us talk about air defense, because protecting pipelines on the ground is only half the battle. You also have to protect them from the sky. Saudi Arabia did not arrive at this moment unprepared. American-made Patriot and THAAD air defense systems were activated at full capacity in the eastern region, in Riyadh, and at the strategic Al-Kharj air base as soon as the crisis began. But the Saudis recognized something important. American systems alone, powerful as they are, were not optimized for the kind of asymmetric swarm drone attacks Iran had been refining for years through its proxies. So, they went shopping. In a diplomatic move that shocked analysts, Saudi Arabia signed an agreement with Ukraine, a country fighting for its very existence, for the urgent delivery of next-generation Ukrainian-made interceptor missiles. Ukraine had spent years perfecting drone interception in real combat. By bringing that hard-won expertise directly to the Arabian Desert, Riyadh created a shield that Iran had not anticipated. Saudi Arabia also activated its defense pact with Pakistan. Pakistani air defense systems and specialized military personnel were deployed to Saudi territory during the crisis's most intense days. The message to Iran was unmistakable. Attacking Saudi Arabia now means confronting not just the kingdom, but Islamabad, a nuclear-armed power as well. And perhaps the most geopolitically surprising development, Riyadh finalized a quiet agreement with China for a drone production facility to be established in Jeddah. Saudi Arabia was preparing not just to defend itself from this crisis, but to be self-sufficient in asymmetric warfare for the next one. On the multilateral diplomatic front, a meeting of foreign ministers from 13 countries, including Turkey and Pakistan, convened in Riyadh. The ministers explicitly condemned the attacks targeting civilian areas and infrastructure in neighboring countries, emphasizing that no circumstances could justify such actions and calling on Iran to cease its attacks and return to diplomacy. The Russian government told state media that it was watching events closely and urging restraint on all sides, a diplomatic performance that masks something far more cynical. The Saudi foreign minister delivered one of the most direct warnings in recent Gulf diplomatic history, stating publicly that Saudi Arabia's patience is not unlimited and that Iran's strategy targeting its neighbors is not spontaneous, but part of a decade-long war plan. He made clear that if Iran does not stop, there will be no trust left to rebuild at any negotiating table. On the military front, the picture for Iran is devastating. The Iranian Air Force no longer exists. Since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, over 7,000 strategic targets have been struck on Iranian soil. More than 100 Iranian warships and fast attack craft have been sent to the bottom of the ocean. Iran's air defense networks have collapsed. Hezbollah has sustained heavy damage. The Houthis, while aligned with Iran, have at least for now maintained a fragile truce with Saudi Arabia rather than opening a new front. And yet, here is the baffling paradox at the heart of this crisis. Iran refuses to come to the negotiating table. Why? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps understands something that most governments do not want to admit out loud. For the IRGC's commanders, this war is not a catastrophe. It is a business model. Every day the strait remains closed. Black market oil tankers seized in the strait become direct revenue for the IRGC. Every passing day complicates the diplomatic landscape in ways that protect the Guard from accountability. A negotiated peace settlement would mean transparency, international oversight, and the potential dismantling of the very parallel economy that keeps IRGC commanders wealthy. War protects them. Peace threatens everything they have built. This is why Iran is not negotiating, not because they think they can win, but because for the people who actually run Iran's military apparatus, the war economy is personally profitable. And here is the truly remarkable part. Iran is not the only one cashing in on the chaos. Moscow has constructed what might be the most ruthless and cynical geopolitical play of the decade. Russia earns more on every barrel of oil it sells with prices 60% above pre-crisis levels. China cannot get enough Gulf oil because Hormuz is effectively closed. No problem. Russia is pumping energy directly to Beijing via pipelines that no navy can block and no air force can target. Both India and China have strong incentives to deepen their reliance on Russian supply, given the disruption of Middle Eastern barrels. India, facing the most acute near-term exposure, is already pivoting to Russian crude. China, which had been moderating its Russian imports, has abandoned that restraint entirely. Ruble-yuan trade is breaking all-time records. And Russia, a country under Western sanctions fighting an active war, is sitting on a cash windfall large enough to prop up its war economy and continue financing its military operations. Russia did not start this war, but it built its entire energy strategy to profit from exactly this kind of disruption. China is playing its own quiet game. While the world watches the Gulf burn, Beijing is securing discounted Iranian oil, purchasing the last drops available from a cornered, desperate Iran at 30 to 40% below market price. Iran's primary revenue source has been devastated, and China is absorbing it at a bargain. So let us do the final accounting. Iran's nuclear facilities struck, its navy at the bottom of the ocean, its air defense network collapsed, the Strait of Hormuz, its greatest strategic weapon, largely neutralized by Saudi and UAE pipelines, Hezbollah degraded, the Houthis sitting on the sidelines, Iran's own oil exports severely curtailed. And yet the conflict continues because the IRGC has decided that prolonging suffering is strategically preferable to accepting terms. And Russia has decided that the global chaos serves its interests perfectly. And China has decided to quietly buy assets while everyone else is distracted by the fire. This is geopolitics at its most cold-blooded. Not a story of heroes and villains, though there are clearly aggressors and victims. It is a story of interests, of who benefits when the world's most critical energy artery goes dark. Saudi Arabia's engineers built a steel lifeline through 1,200 kilometers of empty desert in 1981, and in March of 2026, it delivered. The UAE's pipeline quietly rerouted the country's oil production to safety before most of the world even noticed. Together, they proved that decades of strategic infrastructure investment can make the difference between a manageable crisis and a complete economic collapse. But it was not enough to make the crisis painless. 400 ships are still stranded. Grocery prices are spiking across the Gulf. Schools are closed in Pakistan, and oil is still hovering above $100 a barrel with no clear end in sight. On the 29th of March, a meeting was hosted with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey to discuss reopening the strait. On the 30th of March, the United States Treasury Secretary said the United States would gradually take control over the Strait of Hormuz. On that same day, the Ukrainian president offered his country's expertise to help unblock the strait, pointing to Ukraine's success in keeping its Black Sea ports open, despite relentless attacks using a combination of armed surface drones, coastal artillery, and strategic insurance arrangements. The world is looking for solutions, and it is going to take more than pipelines to find them. What happens next in the Gulf will shape the global economy for years. These steel pipelines in the middle of the Arabian Desert have permanently changed the calculus of energy geopolitics. Saudi Arabia has effectively neutralized Iran's greatest weapon. The question now is whether Iran will simply shift to a strategy of grinding attrition that no pipeline can stop. And that is why the most consequential infrastructure on the planet right now is not a nuclear facility, not a naval fleet, not an air defense system. It is a 45-year-old oil pipeline running quietly through the Saudi desert.